slovo.
Okay. Slides? Great. Okay, well, I'm standing between you and lunch, and we're already running late, so I put on Twitter the abbreviated version of this, which is that open data is good for everyone, so just do it. I understand the Slovak government have just received a €4 million grant from the European Union to help with open data. So the thing to do is to ask, demand the data that you want, because any government can put out boring data. But why is open data important? Four main drivers. Firstly, it can be used to create new economic and social value. New businesses, making other businesses more efficient, delivering a lot of benefit to consumers. And I'll give some examples of that. It can be used to get greater government transparency, which also has economic effects, because transparent governments are more honest governments. It can be used to improve public services, and some quite dramatic results of that, both in the developed world, but also in the developing world. And the surprise one is it can actually be used to make government more efficient. It turns out governments aren't very good at using their data, but when the data is out there, open for everyone to use, governments themselves start to use it. So let's quickly give some examples of this. You're seeing new data-driven services coming along. This is the last year's poster child of the open data movement. Climate Corporation, started by two engineers from Google in 2006. They take terabytes of data from the US government on soil quality, 60 years of field-by-field crop yields, and data that flows in at several gigabytes a day from the US Weather Service on weather at, I think, 1 million sampling points in the continental United States. And they produce advisory services to farmers, which will tell farmers, in this particular field, this strain of this crop will give this yield with this distribution, and they back that up with offering insurance services to do that. These guys sold out to Monsanto in October last year for $930 million cash. They're one of a small number of billion-dollar corporations that didn't exist 10 years ago and have made their money out of open data. Open data is being used to improve business efficiency. Data on all the planned roadworks in the UK, as well as real-time information on traffic flows, are available. And this is a company called Elgin that does advisory services to trucking companies, so they can route their lorries, route their trucks, so they avoid where the congestion is, not only today, but tomorrow and next week and next month. And it's being used for better business decisions. This is data on prescribing by doctors in the UK, which shows how different policies lead to different costs, and so they can optimize their costs and take out variation. What sort of data is important? Geospatial data is incredibly important. The research for the European Union estimated about half the benefit of open data actually comes from open geospatial data. In Denmark, they decided to have a single, accurate national address register available to everyone in the private sector and the public sector, free as open data. The Danish government's investment in that has been returned 70 times in terms of the benefit to the Danish economy and the Danish public service. Transport information in London, there are something like 25 open data feeds, most of them real time, about metros, buses, cycle hire, roads and the like. There are 500 applications using that open data, employing about 5,000 people in the application ecosystem. Not all bearded developers, they're marketeers, people doing support and so on. And the benefit to London now runs at 58 times the cost of implementing open data in the Transport Authority for London. 58 to 1 return on investment. It's the best investment ever made in transport in the UK. Census, the UK census benefits the private sector by about €400 million a year. In the UK, we find it very difficult to measure what the benefit to the public sector is, but it's a really big tool for marketing, location planning for the private sector in the UK. Government spending and procurement, often seen as a transparency data set. There's a company called Spikes Gavel in the UK who take that data and turn it into business intelligence. Because in that detailed spending data, it's intelligence on which agency, which public agency is spending how much with what supplier on what goods. That's led to a more competitive market in supply to government, more small and medium-sized enterprises being able to bid, and better results for government too. Weather data is also important. In the European Union, Nelly Kroes recently retired as Vice President, led the drive towards the revised Public Sector Information Directive. The evidence base of that showed a potential of 200 billion euros a year benefit to EU 27, as then was, from open data. And most of that benefit actually not going to the big IT firms, but actually going to businesses that use data-rich services and going to citizens who can plan their journeys, find out about locations of things and so on. Second area of benefit, transparency, greater transparency. Is your money being spent well? Governments around the world are starting to publish detailed spending data, not just a budget, but details of every payment they make. Every government department and every local authority in the UK was mandated to do that by the new government in 2010. They all did it except one municipality. Something like 2,000 public bodies did that within 9 months. It didn't cost them a lot of money, and that data is being mined. And journalists are using open data to really hold government to account. This is a lovely, some of the best of these actually work for the Buenos Aires newspaper La Nación in Argentina. These guys went through 285,000 documents released by the Argentinian government, who thought they could never be analyzed because they were all sort of images and PDF documents. They went through all this with crowdsourcing technologies, involved a lot of people, a lot of readers, and they actually found that subsidies to bus companies, 6 bus companies, had gone up by about 20 times over 4 years. Data is being used to track international corporate transparency. This slide's from a background they'd done for the G8 summit last year, where open company data group that I'm an advisor to, called Open Corporates, have now got company registers from so many countries that they can sort of track how one corporation owns another corporation, owns another corporation, owns another corporation. This is a company in Morgan Stanley where there's a chain of ownership through, I think, 12 different companies across 6 different jurisdictions, through 2 different tax havens. The question to government leaders is, if a multinational is doing this, and we're starting to get this data out, why are they doing it? And perhaps it is that these multinationals are not actually controlled or governed by any government anymore, that they just go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Open data is being used to improve public services, releasing the clinical outcomes of in the UK, 4 years ago, we started to publish data that had been collected for many years on hospital-acquired infections. Without any new money to the National Health Service, 4 years after publishing that data, hospital-acquired infections had gone down by 85%. The money that had previously been allocated for cleaning hospitals and training staff in hygienic techniques, but was being used for other things, was suddenly used to drive down infections, do the deep cleaning, good hand washing discipline, and so on. So publishing the data started managers thinking about how they were managed, how they were measured, and got a behavioral response. As I said, data is being used for more efficient government too. In British Columbia in Canada, the government had an open data initiative, published a lot of open data, and then they started to analyze, well, who's looking at this data? And they found that 1/3 of the downloads were actually coming from the government of British Columbia itself, from IP addresses owned by the government of British Columbia. Putting the data out there on the web made their data easier to find, even by public officials. If one public official wanted the data, they no longer had to go and negotiate with someone else and why do you want this data? Oh, well, we haven't got time to release this for you. It was out there on the web and they could download it when they needed it. And others can help improve government data. In the UK, we released transport data covering the location of 300,000 bus stops. OpenStreetMap wanted to take that onto OpenStreetMap, the Wikipedia of maps, but they came back to us and said, well, some of these bus stops seem to be wrong. We don't think it's very sensible to have a bus stop in the middle of a lake, for instance. And in the end, OpenStreetMap's volunteers validated all this data, and they submitted 18,000 corrections to the data, which have now been put into the government database as well. So, the importance of open data, economic value, greater transparency, improved public services, and a more efficient government. And finally, I think, just to say, most people think, government's role is just to supply some data, put it out there and things happen. 5 years in this business have now taught me that it's a bit more complicated than that. So when thinking about how the Slovak government used their 4 million euros, building a fancy website is not the only thing that has to be done. Indeed, a fancy website doesn't really help. Just give us the data, please. Government needs to be a supplier, but it needs to be a sensible supplier. Any government can supply boring data that nobody uses. Governments need to supply the data that people want to use. They need to ask people what data they want. They need to realize that the data people want is going to be some of the hardest to release, precisely because it's so important. Governments want to control it. So they need a release process and to supply data people want. Government needs to lead. Actually, quite a lot of data that's interesting is not owned by the government itself, but it's owned by parts of the public services. So data owned by bus companies and train companies and the like needs to be got out. And that means government needs to use its influence to persuade people providing public services, even from the private sector, to open up their data. And government needs to catalyze the private sector use of data. Not just put the data out on the website, but actually work with businesses to make that used effectively. In the US, Todd Park, until recently the Chief Technology Officer at the White House, ran a series of business roundtables where every government department had to get interacting with business on how their data could be used and how they could make their data better for business to use. In the UK, we've set up the Open Data Institute in Tech City in London, specifically to work with businesses, to incubate new businesses using open data. They've started, I think they've incubated now 12 businesses, of which 11 have found venture capital or other funding and have gone on to be self-sustaining. And they're really driving this business use, its economic use of data. And finally, governments have got to be sensible users of the data themselves and use data-rich services. Some of the business analytic tools that are now available actually aren't being used in government as much as you might think. So actually getting the data out there and allowing people to use business analytic tools and supply those services back to government is a good way to go. And this slide was actually from Catalonia's implementation of the EU Inspire initiative. They found that when they'd implemented Inspire, all their costs were recovered within 6 months by administrative savings because they could now find their own data. So thank you very much. As I say, open data benefits everyone. It's important. So Slovakia, please just do it. Thank you.